Good evening from Tokyo. I'm John Bradford, the president of the Yokosuka Council on Asia-Pacific Studies, YCAPS, and also a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow at the National Graduate Institute of Policy Studies. It's my great pleasure to welcome you today to the fifth in the series of maritime discussion events being co-organized by YCAPS and the Pacific Forum. Our last two events focused on the South China Sea, and now I find it very appropriate and interesting that we're moving on to the Eastern Indian Ocean. While discussing this increasingly important body of water, the idea is that we'll talk about emerging issues, both traditional security and state rivalry and non-traditional events such as illicit trafficking, overfishing, etc. This body of water is often being compared by analysts and commentators to the South China Sea, and even referring to it as sort of the next South China Sea conflict. That analogy seems to have some utility, but given that the geographic and cultural identity of this body of water is in many, many ways very different, I think that the analogy is only useful to such an extent. Luckily, you don't have to take my word for it. We're going to discuss this, and maybe I'll be wrong, with two of the world's leading authorities on this topic. I'm happy to remind you today that the event is on the record. It will be recorded, and after some editing and some technical procedures, it will be available for review on the Pacific Forum's website. So without further ado, let me introduce our two speakers. The first is Dr. Asyura Salleh. She is a vastly non-resident fellow at the Pacific Forum, and her work experience includes work for the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, the One Earth Future Foundation, and the Brunei Prime Minister's Office. She also holds a doctorate from the Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. Our second speaker will be Commander Abhijit Singh. He is a senior fellow and the head of the Maritime Policy Initiative at the Observer Research Foundation. Prior to becoming a full-time researcher, he had a long career in the Indian Navy. And even while he was on active duty, he began developing his strong record for publication, research, and informed commentary. His many publications include two very good books on Indian Ocean security. So with that brief introduction, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Asyura for some prepared remarks. Once she finishes speaking, we'll turn it over to Commander Abhijit, and then we'll take questions from the audience. If you do have questions, please either use the raise your hand function and I'll call on you to speak, or just type it in chat. I'll read it verbatim or summarize if appropriate and pitch it to the two experts. So, Dr. Asyura, please.
Thanks very much, John, and the Pacific Forum for this opportunity to share my thoughts. Before we begin, I do hope that everyone is staying safe and sound at home during these challenging times. I'd like to leave most of the discussion to the question and answer session, so I'll dive straight into it. So often when examining maritime security in the Asia-Pacific, much of our attention is naturally directed to the South China Sea. But by embracing maritime security as a broader concept that tries to extend beyond state competition for influence, I think we'll be able to see that maritime security is actually more than that. In fact, maritime security, especially to people within this region, is a lifeline to most of them. It has the ability to threaten or even support human and food security. And as in the Eastern Indian Ocean, as in what we're looking in today, especially in the maritime areas of the Andaman Sea or the Bay of Bengal, maritime security can also encompass illicit activities, such as maritime drug trafficking and illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, also known as IUU fishing. And these activities have shown to have widespread and detrimental consequences on not just the livelihood of coastal populations, but also on the public health of regional countries, and even more so on the economic future of the Asia-Pacific. In these 10 minutes that I have ahead of me, I will try my best to address key main points on two maritime crimes that I feel are underexplored, especially in this part of the world. This would be maritime drug trafficking and IUU fishing. But in my research and looking at these two crimes, what I have seen is that maritime security is inevitably and almost always an extension of developments that are taking place on land. Factors such as the weak rule of law, governance, low levels of enforcement levels, all have an impact on the rate of these crimes and the extent of their impact on regional security. And in today's times, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen that the virus has demonstrated the ability to exacerbate fissures that already exist on land, producing spillovers in the activities and enforcement that take place in the maritime domain. So when looking at maritime drug trafficking, I've got three main points that I thought we could potentially discuss. The first is that drug traffickers are highly adaptable and alternative trafficking routes will always present itself. Enforcement agencies will need to start adopting more holistic and whole-of-society approaches to engage a wider sector of stakeholder groups, and when trying to keep up with the changing and ingenious modus operandi that these drug traffickers are coming up with. When looking at the production sites of methamphetamine in Myanmar's Shan State, for example, enforcement pressure is increasing on these production sites and also on the land-based trafficking routes that are being used. And so what we are observing more and more is that drug traffickers are relying increasingly on the Andaman Sea to move meth out of Myanmar. This route is also known as the Western Maritime Route, and it is currently being employed to distribute meth westwards towards Bangladesh through Taiknaf and the Cox's Bazar, and even southwards towards Southeast Asia and eventually around Sulawesi to reach Australia. Also, drug traffickers are employing more and more ingenious types of tactics. This can include a mothership arrangement and even the use of traditional fishing equipment to try transfer meth down along the coastlines of the countries bordering the Andaman Sea. Secondly, as long as factors that exist on land continue to persist, maritime drug trafficking will continue. There are several factors that continue to drive maritime drug trafficking, and this can range by the escalated rate of the production of meth in Myanmar's Shan State, which is leaving drugs more and more accessible to potential consumers because the prices of meth has been driven down drastically. A good point is to look at the price of 1 kilogram of meth in Malaysia in 2013, which was at 45,000 USD. 5 years later, this had fallen to 12,000 USD. Another factor is under-governance, which provides a conducive environment for the production and also the transfer of drugs. We've got special economic zones that are dotted along the coastlines of the Andaman Sea that provides a conducive environment by offering lax trade regulations, oversight, weak enforcement, and all of this will be able to facilitate the storage and transfer of drugs as well. I think we should keep an eye out for the Hilawa and Dawe special economic zones and deep sea port, which is currently being developed in southern Myanmar. The third land-based conflict is persistent conflict that's happening in the Rakhine State. And this is constantly correlating with growing flows of yaba towards Bangladesh. In fact, from January to April 2020, according to ACLED, the COVID-19 pandemic has offered a cover for the rate of conflict to increase by 74% in the Rakhine State relative to the same period last year. And fourthly, while development may be a blessing in its own ways, it can also pose its challenges. The infrastructure building that connects Lasio, for example, which is a city in Myanmar, to Mandalay through a road highway, actually facilitates the movement of meth from the Shan State. Upon reaching Mandalay, the meth can then flow down the river and eventually hit the south and western coasts of Myanmar. And we also have urbanization, which works in the favor of drug traffickers, because a high concentration of people that migrate to these cities in order to work for labor-heavy positions such as cab driving or construction is further fueling the demand for drugs, especially the cheaper range of meth such as yaba. And technology is another form of development which offers increasing interconnectivity. More and more potential consumers are using social media apps such as Line to connect easily to their suppliers, who then bring in the drugs quite easily and quite efficiently as well. The third point related to maritime drug trafficking is that information sharing is the key to addressing most of these enforcement challenges that drug and maritime law enforcement agencies are facing in counter drug trafficking at sea. There is a severe information deficit in which agencies do not have enough accurate and actionable intel that can be used to develop a shared understanding of illicit activities that are taking place. By encouraging more information sharing through a variety of capacity building workshops, for example, information sharing will be able to contribute to maritime domain awareness and help these agencies overcome friction factors such as the challenging operational environment or the wide surface area of the Andaman Sea and the Bay of Bengal. And in order to do this, there needs to be stronger interagency coordination, not just between maritime law enforcement agencies like the Coast Guards and the Navy, but also across sectors between drug enforcement agencies and the Coast Guards, for example. By sharing information, agencies that do not have capabilities that are not on par with other countries will be able to identify the gaps, the capacity and knowledge gaps that they will need to fill. And in doing so, this can enhance cross-border coordination and the transfer of drug seizure cases across boundaries. So in looking at our second maritime case, which is IUU fishing, I thought it's worth bringing up because I feel that this topic is severely underaddressed in the region. But this is despite the fact that IUU fishing has dramatic implications on the region in the Bay of Bengal. Economically speaking, the values of illegal catches in the bay were between 3 to 10 billion US dollars every year. And on top of that, 60 million fishes live below the poverty line. The second point is that fish really do not have any passports. And I think we could look into this a bit deeper in the discussion as to how sovereign-based norms can be used or may not be applicable in addressing non-traditional threats such as the fishery crisis. Fish do not have passports. They don't abide by the border. In fact, the decimated fish stocks are pushing artisanal fishes further out into the sea, transforming them into unwelcome foreign fishes that face the risk of action by the enforcement authorities. And on top of these artisanal fishes, we've got large commercial vessels that continue to fish in the Bay of Bengal at an uncontrollable rate. And if this continues, it is expected that global fish stocks will drastically decline and in fact cease to exist by 2050. And that would just be in 30 years' time. And all of this is despite the fact that Bangladesh, India, and Myanmar have already delineated their respective maritime borders in the Bay of Bengal. Thirdly, more can be done to address fishery conservation in the Bay of Bengal, despite the fact that regional platforms for this already exists. We've got SAARC, BIMSTEC, and Asyura, which will provide the potential opportunity for active regional collaboration. But yet, fishery preservation remains a secondary priority in most of these forums. Yet there have been success cases, all is not lost. Under the Bay of Bengal large marine ecosystem, Bangladesh has worked hard to revive the Hilsa shad fish species. By working with a range of stakeholders, including USAID, NGOs such as the World Fish and even the Department of Fisheries, the production of Hilsa shad has increased by 5% every year since 2015. But this only points to the fact that most efforts in trying to address IUU fishing remains unilateral. More efforts to preserve fishery stocks need to be taken place. There has to be wider regional coordination and region-wide monitoring, control, and surveillance. And on top of that, the solution to IUU fishing does not lie solely in heightening levels of enforcement at sea. As with maritime drug trafficking, the solution needs to be holistic, and it needs to include other stakeholders as well. I think we could look into how Bangladesh is enforcing a 65-day ban designed to rejuvenate the fishery stocks. But a ban such as this needs to be accompanied with more initiatives to protect the livelihood of the fishes that are prevented from going out to sea. And then we've got more transboundary fish species as well, such as the Indian mackerel, which offers the opportunity for regional countries to coordinate their fishing solutions. I'll stop here, but I think it's best for us to remember that when examining maritime areas in our region, we need to always remember that maritime security is a broader concept. And on top of that, it has close causal linkages to developments that take place on land. By adopting a holistic lens, I hope that we will be able to identify solutions to maritime threats by addressing factors that are rooted on land. Sure, stronger levels of enforcement may be required to curtail activities at sea, but they need to be complemented with better information sharing and more active regional coordination in other areas. We also need to adopt a whole of society approach that incorporates the role of other stakeholders, such as the coastal populations, nonprofit, local government units. And in doing so, I do hope that maritime crimes can be curtailed and safety at sea can be better guaranteed. Thanks very much for your time. And I do hope I was able to shed some light on this topic. Over to you, John.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Asyura. That's really illuminating. Both drug trafficking and IUU fishing are critical issues, not just in the Bay of Bengal and the Andaman Sea, but around the world. But I think the challenges, as you've illuminated, are very specific in those waters because of the specific geography. I hope that you can talk more about this in your remarks and maybe also broaden the conversation, include state-to-state rivalry. Commander Abhijit.
Right, thank you, John. At the outset, let me thank you for inviting me for this discussion. It's my first time at a PAC Forum event, and I'm thankful for the opportunity. I'd like to mention at the outset that that as a maritime analyst, what I realized is that the Bay of Bengal, sometimes the discussions surrounding the Bay of Bengal are actually more about traditional security than they are about non-traditional. And what I find interesting in the presentation that Dr. Asyura just made was that her focus was completely on the irregular security issues that we're facing in the region. That is just as well, because I think that these areas don't get the importance that they actually deserve. I would also say that that some recent research from India has actually focused on the non-traditional securities issues within the Bay. And for those that have been following events in the region, the BIMSTEC, an organization that recently has been revived by India and the Bay States, does look at these issues in great detail. Now, what I will do in the few minutes that I have is actually try and present an Indian realist perspective of other security challenges in this region. And I say realist because a lot of the other countries in the region have not actually looked at the Bay of Bengal, or rather they desist from looking at the Bay of Bengal as a strategic space. The focus more is on non-traditional security issues, which it should be, but from a purely Indian perspective, there's a more geopolitical, a balance of power narrative that also needs to be put out there. So how do Indian analysts, Indian scholars, Indian policymakers look at the Bay of Bengal? And I would say that there are 2 or 3 aspects to the Bay of Bengal that India seems to emphasize. The first is that the Bay of Bengal is really a strategic theater. It is what it is. It's a buffer space that connects the South Asian littorals with the Southeast Asian littorals, and in other words, the Eastern Indian Ocean with the South China Sea. What it also does is that it gives India some kind of strategic depth, meaning that it puts some space between the South China Sea and South Asia, which means that the impact of what China is doing in Southeast Asia, its aggressive forays, its land reclamation, and the other aggressive activities that it engages in, or that impact is not felt in the Indian Ocean region, and India somehow controls the dynamic of the Bay of Bengal. So the focus, basically, from an Indian perspective, is to posit the Bay of Bengal as a bridge that connects South Asia with Southeast Asia, but a very Indian bridge, a bridge with Indian characteristics, something that India has a degree of authority, influence, and control over. The second aspect of the Bay that I find interesting, again from as I hear Indian policymakers and Indian scholars speak on the subject, is the idea that it is a common security space. So when they use the expression common security space, the emphasis really is on the Bay being a social construct. It's a social entity, meaning it has an indigenous rhythm, it's civilizational, there is cultural connections, and it's important for issues like food, livelihood, community development, resources, and ultimately national prosperity. And therefore, we get to hear a lot in the Bay of Bengal context about blue economy projects, ways in which the seas can be used to generate prosperity for the people. Now, these things are important for India because it's basically about treating the Bay of Bengal as a community space, and to also let the other stakeholders know that their priorities, their choices, their interests matter to India. And it's just not as if India is trying to run roughshod over the interests of the other regional stakeholders. So that's the other thing that's important about the Bay of Bengal. Now, when it comes to non-traditional security issues, and I'm just going to sort of touch on this because it's important. It's an important piece of the traditional security puzzle. The way India looks at non-traditional security issues is to actually group them into three baskets. There are constabulary issues, meaning issues like piracy, armed robbery, trafficking, terrorism, etc., which Indians feel can somehow be managed through interagency cooperation between the Indian Navy, perhaps coast guards of the region, other navies, etc., and plus agencies like customs, etc. We can somehow control these crime in the region. The other issues are administrative, and some of the things that Dr. Asyura pointed out in her presentation. Coastal shipping, there's maritime transport, the fact that there's the ports in the region are not very efficient. And these are all issues that again Indian analysts feel that through a high level of bureaucratic transactions, so through greater bureaucratic coordination and interaction, we can somehow also be able to contain these problems, or for that matter, be able to look for ways in which we can do things better in these areas. The third and most complex problems, again from a Bay of Bengal perspective, and talk not only for India, for a number of other countries, are the environmental issues. Again, something that my co-panelists has pointed out. Now here, what I'd like to say is that the problem, as I see, is not just the fact that there is lack of capacity. The fact is that there is the policies that that are being deployed to tackle these problems are inadequate. For instance, if you look at the problem of overfishing, the fact is not that these are fishermen on overdrive and they're just going out there and picking up whatever fish they can find. The fact is that there is government subsidy that is being offered to these fishermen, who go out there and who use unsustainable practices like bottom trawling, sign net fishing. So what they're doing is that they're actually digging up entire ecosystems and throwing back the dead fish into the water, and that creates huge dead zones. So one of the big problems that the Bay of Bengal is facing is dead zones, and that means it has no life. Now, how does this link up with traditional security? How it links up is as follows: that when India in international fora, or rather in regional fora, speaks to its partners and tries to draw their attention to the problem of China being a big force in the region, the regional states point out that India should not be focused too much on the China problem because, well, we have this huge problem of dead zones. We have a huge problem of IUU fishing. We have a huge problem of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and that we should be solely focused on this. But again, as I said, from an Indian perspective, the China angle or the China element to the puzzle is equally important. Now, how has China been spreading its footprint or its tentacles in the region? I would say that what it's done is that we know of the fact that the anti-piracy operations in the Indian Ocean are growing. They're not so much in the Bay of Bengal, but otherwise they are very much a force in the Indian Ocean. There have been instances of Chinese submarine deployments in the region, and China's port building activity, especially in places like Hambantota in Chittagong, and also in Shokfu port in Myanmar, suggests that the Chinese want to have a bigger stake, an economic stake in the region. Now, what's interesting, again from an Indian perspective, is that a lot of these ports are actually not very commercially viable. And a favorite example that Indian analysts will give you is that of Hambantota, wherein the Chinese came in, they pumped in a lot of money, and they developed a port in a region that already has Colombo, that's already drawing in a great deal of traffic. So the question that Indian analysts ask is that did China carry out a feasibility study before putting in investing so much of money into Hambantota? And apparently they did. So it seems to Indian policymakers and Indian observers is that these were strategic investments, that China simply made these investments because it wanted to penetrate into South Asia, and it wants some sort of a strategic presence in South Asia and in the Bay of Bengal. The third area that concerns India is that in the aftermath of COVID, there is a lot of COVID diplomacy that's happening in the region, whereas China is trying to push its BRI projects through. And we see this, especially in the case of Myanmar, wherein there's some pressure from China that the Myanmaris should should in some ways speed up Chinese projects in the region. That's again worrisome. In a recent paper that I did for the ORF, I pointed out that India should also be concerned about the fact that, well, that what's happening in the South China Sea is beginning to have an impact in the Eastern Indian Ocean. So, for instance, if you look at the fact that the Chinese militias that were up until now very active in the South China Sea, some of this militia presence we are seeing in the Indian Ocean region. And when I say militias, I don't really mean Chinese fishermen going out there and carrying out aggressive activities. But what I mean is Chinese research vessels, non-combat vessels, survey ships, intelligence ships, mining vessels. They're all there in the Indian Ocean. A lot of this is happening near the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And that's, again, something that worries India a bit. I'm going to finally say this, because I know time is short and we could sort of take the conversation forward during the Q&A, that China's salami slicing tactics in the South China Sea is well known. It has often been said that the South China Sea has nothing in common with the Eastern Indian Ocean. And the fact is that the Eastern Indian Ocean has a very different dynamic. It does not in any way resemble what happens in South China Sea, which is really about territorial conflict, and it's about sovereign disputes. But what we are seeing is that the way in which the Eastern Indian Ocean is being militarized, the manner in which the Chinese have developed their ports in the region, and the fact that now non-military presence is also growing, along with military presence, not so much in the Bay of Bengal, but in South Asia and the Western Indian Ocean. It seems that difference between the South China Sea and the Eastern Indian Ocean is shrinking. And then we have this incident that happens on the border, the India-China border in the north, where China has occupied Indian territory at least 5 places along the border. So one of the things that now I'm seeing and we are getting to hear is that salami slicing tactics is playing out on the border with India, and that gradually in time, as the Chinese begin to grow their presence in the Indian Ocean region, a similar salami slicing tactics will also be at play at sea in the Eastern Indian Ocean. Will this make the Eastern Indian Ocean another South China Sea? I doubt. It might not. But again, as I said, that this is not going to be that same peaceful, tranquil space that it was in the past. The more we see China getting assertive about its rights and interests in the Indian Ocean region, we are going to see more of Chinese presence. We're going to see more of Chinese naval and non-naval, non-combat ships. And that just might make the strategic dynamic in this region more complicated for India. New Delhi might just find that it is not in control of what's happening in the space in the same way as it was in the past. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for those illuminating conversations. I'm going to ask the first question, and that'll be to our most recent speaker, Commander Abhijit. You talk about China's salami slicing strategies, and there's clear examples of that with the territorial issues in the South China Sea, and there's even probably in many ways a clear example along the border, where you might even your slice of salami might just be measured in meters.
Yeah.
But given the lack of Chinese or PRC claims to territory in the Bay of Bengal and the Andaman Sea, how would that play out? Is there a different type of salami, or are there claims coming, or are there claims maybe I don't know about?
Well, John, that's an interesting question. And it's a question that we often hear, that given the fact that the Chinese have no territorial claims over in the Eastern Indian Ocean, why should India really be worried about their presence in the region? Well, you see, the difference is that India has a different standard by which it measures peace, or for that matter, it measures the security in the Bay of Bengal. I think the very fact that the Chinese are now in the region presenting themselves as some kind of security providers, the fact that they are now going to be doing providing capacity or building capacity for the regional states. And we know of the fact that, there have been submarines that are going to be transferred to Thailand. They've already, the Bangladeshis already have 2 main-class submarines. There was a frigate that was gifted to the Sri Lankans recently. So this is not really about territory for India. The fact is that India's strategic leverage, India's influence in the region is slowly being diluted. And that is something that is creating great worry in India's security establishment. So even if China does not nibble any territory, and by the way, it is in some ways nibbling territory. If you look at the case of Hambantota, that is not a space that China claimed as a Chinese space. But Hambantota today is very much a Chinese enclave. Similarly, when the Chinese are talking about developing a base in Bangladesh, in Cox's Bazar, the Indians have little doubt that this base ultimately is going to be used as a Chinese facility. So willy-nilly, the Chinese, despite not really having any claims to territory in the region, will very much be a presence in the space. And this is a space that, as I said, India believes it has a historic and a sort of civilizational investment in. It has a sort of a proprietary sense about the space. And therefore, I think that it doesn't quite matter whether the Chinese actually have any territorial claims in the Eastern Indian Ocean. The fact is that once they are going to be present in the region in greater strength, once the Chinese are going to be accepted as a regional power player, regional stakeholder, India's interests are going to be affected in some way, shape, or form.
Okay, thanks. If we can pivot back to the non-traditional, the first question that came in the chat windows comes from Haris Fawzan Othman, and he asks, why is there relatively less attention paid to IU fishing when it is known that if not addressed will lead only to more problems in food resources? So if I can take that question and then expand a little bit, what I'm wondering about is, given the severity of the non-traditional problems, so-called non-traditional problems such as IU fishing, and also as was highlighted earlier, the drug trade, these problems are well known, yet there's not a lot of public discourse on them. There's not a lot of intellectual discourse on them. If you want to find an expert outside of the law enforcement agencies, they're hard to find. In the sort of nonprofit track 2 dialogues, there's some, but few. So I guess I'd ask both of you, but Dr. Asyura first, given the severity of them, why is there a dearth of information and conversation?
Thanks, John. I'll begin with answering your question because I think that sets a good precedence on inserting a call for more research really in this field on non-traditional areas. I think that more needs to definitely be done on non-traditional issues, particularly because as we become a lot more globalized and as we see incidents such as the COVID-19 pandemic having the ability to impact the world on such a global scale, in fact, maritime crimes are able to do this just as much as well. And I think a particular issue as to why there's just not enough discourse is because there's not enough research out there drawing the direct link between maritime crimes and traditional security threats. This appears in IUU fishing and maritime drug trafficking issues as well. And in fact, recently there has been more discourse on hybrid challenges. And this is the closest that we're able to see on how fishing nationalism tactics have an impact on national security interests. But yet I think that we need to start looking at national security beyond traditional interests and to also understand that national security can be impacted by public health, by regional economies, and even by significant losses through IUU fishing, as I mentioned. I think another issue is that non-traditional research in non-traditional areas require the input of anthropologists and cultural experts, which I think as political scientists may not be as interested in looking at. But this is definitely a call for more interdisciplinary research, perhaps, on non-traditional areas. But in addressing the question on IUU fishing, I feel that, as Abhijit brought up earlier, he mentioned that one of the priority areas was blue economy, which in fact is a issue which is looked on by most of the regional forums out there, but not so much in IUU fishing. I think IUU fishing remains to be a secondary priority. And this is primarily due to, I feel, the lack of trust that needs to be engendered across these regional organizations. And I think that in encouraging more regional coordination on IUU fishing, this would actually be a good precedence for a lot of regional countries, including those in SAARC and BIMSTEC, to start working together to establish more joint measures on fishery preservation. And I think this can obviously be addressed by building more shared awareness. And this again boils down to John's call for more research on non-traditional issue areas. Thanks, John.
Great. Can we know Abhijit?
Yes, I think one of the major problems with regard to both IUU fishing and blue economy, as Surya mentioned, is that there is a dilemma that confronts Bay States, which is how do you balance between economy and ecology? The more you focus on growth, which is harnessing of the resources from the sea, the more you're likely to actually be overexploiting those resources and in some ways damaging the ecology of the region. And I think what's happened with regard to fisheries is not just the fact that it's a crime that we are somehow unable to contain because of less law enforcement capacity. But as I mentioned some time back, the fact also is that the policies that we are using or that we are deploying to tackle this problem are grossly inadequate. Now, I've told you, in my initial remarks, I'd mentioned that there is great subsidy that's being offered to these poor fishermen to go out there. They've been given machines. They've been given, very fine nets to go out there and fish as much as they can, because for them it's a matter of livelihood. But what these fishermen do is that when they go out into the sea, they use these unsustainable fishing practices, and therefore, what that creates is really an unvirtuous cycle. And there's no way that we can actually solve the problem unless we don't get our policy right. With blue economy, we have exactly the same problem. The problem with blue economy, and if I can just point that out, is that the blue economy is about sustainable growth, inclusive sustainable growth. But the manner in which governments and industry understand this is about just going and using the resources of the sea to generate more wealth, generate more prosperity. And that again impinges on the ecology, on sustainable practices. And somehow we are never able to create the balance that we really need at sea. So I think that the Bay States, one of the big things that they are grappling with at this moment is how to create consensus in the region, that all of them are going to follow a certain set of practices, a certain set of policies, that when applied to the seas, will create an equitable framework for all the coastal communities. And that is something that's going to take a little bit of time. I think we've got to be a little more patient with these states, because these are poor countries, and these are very poor people. 60% of people actually living on the coast depend on the seas for their food, for protein. And it's very hard to take some hard measures, some very strong measures, without creating a safety net. And I guess that's what the regional governments are trying to do. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have one hand raised from Kamiya Watake. So I'd like to ask Kamiya-san to ask a question, and please be brief.
Thank you, John. And thank you, Pacific Forum, to hold this wonderful series of seminars. I have been always enjoying this. And today I enjoyed two excellent, speeches, and I learned a lot about the region, which I'm not very familiar with. My question is to Mr. Singh. I learned from your presentation that about the, attempts by China to enhance its presence in the Eastern Indian Ocean, or Chinese attempts to establish its status as a regional stakeholder in the Indian Ocean. My question is very simple. By what kind of strategy is India now trying to address those challenges from increasing presence and increasing influence of China in that region? Thank you very much.
Right. So that's a good question, and the thing is that India's strategy to deal with Chinese growing authority influence in the Indian Ocean region is actually to preserve its own influence. And the way the way the Indians want to do that is to have a more close cooperation and coordination with the regional states. So if you look at Indian policies and Indian responses to the China challenge in recent years, what we've done is that we've given a lot of importance to capacity building, and we're actually trying to be that net security provider for some of these regional countries. So if you so one of the things we've done is that we've built a fusion center. We're trying to collate information about what's happening on the regional seas, trying to share that information with regional countries. We're building radar chains in a number of countries like Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, as also in the Western Indian Ocean, in Seychelles, and in Mauritius and other countries there. So the focus really is to be that relevant power in the region. Not actually to fight China or in some ways instigate the countries against China, but to give them some viable options and to let them know that because we are the dominant regional power, we are the country that can provide them with the security goods that they need. The second area that we're giving a lot of importance to is actually humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, as also maritime domain awareness. Now, on HADR, what we've done is that we are doing these periodic meetings, these periodic conferences with regional states. We are trying to look at ways in which we can build HADR capacity in the region, and that again is letting the regional states know that we actually care about their well-being, we care about their needs, and we can provide them again with the security goods that they need. Thirdly, we are looking for ways in which we can cooperate with our Quad partners, meaning Japan, the US, and Australia, in some of these countries, Bay countries, to build infrastructure. For instance, we have a partnership going with the Japanese, in which we are trying to build some infrastructure in Bangladesh. We are looking for ways in which we can invest in Myanmar. In Sri Lanka, we have identified 3 places where India and Japan can jointly invest and build some viable infrastructure for these countries. So there's a variety of ways in which we are trying to push back China. Most importantly, we point out on the maritime military front, a lot of the coordinated patrol exercises that we used to do with these regional states have now been upgraded to exercises. So we now do regular maritime exercises with the Bangladeshi Navy, with the Myanmarese Navy, with the Indonesian Navy. We don't do a maritime exercise regularly with the Thai Navy, but we do a trilateral with the Thai Navy and the Singaporeese Navy. So we're upping the tempo of our own maritime security presence in the Bay of Bengal. And that is again a sign to China that this is a very characteristically Indian space and that China should sort of steer clear of it. And my last point is going to be this, that we're trying to increase our own presence in the South China Sea. I won't say South China Sea, but in the Western Pacific, again, as a signal to China that if China tries to mess around, it tries to interfere in our waters, we always have the option of being present in spaces that they are sensitive about. And so I think in a variety of ways, in a combination of ways, we're trying to signal to China to stay clear of South Asia. But I think beyond that, we have some sort of sensitivity for Beijing, and I don't think we are going to do something, or rather, Delhi is going to do something that will provoke Beijing into using greater force or into being more assertive and aggressive in South Asia. John.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think some of your comments build very nicely into a question that Charlie Brown from Singapore just posed in the chat room. And he writes, what should the priority for capacity building with the stakeholders be in the Bay of Bengal? Security focus, development focus, government practice focus, all simultaneously, and what lessons learned there are that may have come from other regions? To me, this really is an important question. The donor countries have limited resources, and that's not just in terms of money and capacity, but it's also in sort of the implementers and the government resources in terms of time that they can provide to the region. So I think the question is, how should they prioritize it, and do you have a stab at what the priorities should be? And I'll ask Dr. Asyura to answer that first. And I also want to make sure that you have a chance while you have the microphone to address any of the other things that have come up so far in the conversation.
Sure. Thanks, John. I think there is a significant difference in between what should be the priority and what the priority actually is. Ultimately, it all depends on the agenda setting process and how decision makers are informed on what kind of threats or implications these security issues have on our region. But I think ultimately that the key to resolving most of these security issues, both non-traditional and traditional, is in enhancing regional collaboration, and especially through building maritime domain awareness. And this can be done by collating all information, and this can be in-depth research, but also more actionable and usable intel that can be used by all enforcement agencies. And so I feel that in this regard, the priority should rather be on information sharing and capacity building for sure, because in doing so, Coast Guards or the Sri Lanka Navy, for example, it plays the same role in tackling traditional security issues as it does in dealing with IUU fishing and even drug seizures. So through capacity building and enhanced maritime domain awareness, I feel that regional collaboration will definitely be able to tackle the entire array of security issues, both traditional and non-traditional. Thanks, John.
Yeah. So
do you have anything to add?
I have. So actually, in my view, what I think is that the developmental side of capacity building should get, and I suppose will get, more importance. And that's because most of the Bay States really are looking at developing their own capacities to deal with non-traditional security issues in their near seas. So in some of the discussions that I've had with analysts from these countries is that they're actually just a bit sort of concerned with the fact that all of India's focus tends to be, most of India's focus tends to be on building up maritime surveillance capability in a way that we actually want to have a better picture of what's happening in the region in terms of Chinese presence. But what they would ideally like is that India should also, and for that matter, other donor countries should focus on building HADR, which is humanitarian assistance, disaster relief capability, the look at problem of sea pollution, if there's ways in which we can tackle the problem of sea pollution, have better boats to look to do patrolling activity, to look at, to somehow contain the problem of drug trafficking, etc. So I think what's going to happen in the future is that a lot of the focus is going to continue to remain on developmental activity as well as constabulary activity in these waters. Blue economies is going to get a lot of focus, and if some of you are aware about Prime Minister Modi's recent Indian Ocean initiative, one of the things that he talks about there also is blue economies. He talks about, or rather the document talks about blue economies, that the need for us to preserve maritime ecology. So I think India's focus now is gradually also shifting a little bit simply from the China challenge to the developmental challenges in the region. That does not mean, I think, that the Chinese problem is going to go away or that Indians are going to take their eye off that China ball. I think the focus is very much going to be on keeping a track of what the Chinese are doing in the region. But I think it's going to be done in subtle ways. And I think that's the best way to go for India to move forward on this issue, because India and China actually are not adversaries, so to speak, in the sense that there is no open hostility between the two sides. And so India I think will prioritize non-traditional, but in very subtle ways also pursue traditional security concerns in this region. John.
Okay, thank you. So we have a hand raised from a person going with the handle IFC-IOR. I imagine this is one of the liaison officers at the Information Fusion Center in Singapore. This same individual has asked a couple questions in chat, so I'd like to hand the microphone over to that individual. I just ask you to limit yourself to 2 questions so that others have a chance to participate. So, IFC-IOR, please. Hello, are you ready to speak? Okay, it looks like we may have a technical issue with that.
I actually think I have this question. The question has to do with maritime militias.
Oh, great.
And he says that you mentioned the Chinese militia is also reported in the Eastern Indian Ocean. Could you throw some light on the subject? So let me just say this, that in September last year, there was a Chinese marine survey vessel Xian-1 that was found operating near the Andaman Islands. Now, this is, as I said in my opening remarks, this is not the sort of militia that one is used to seeing in the South China Sea, which is really more about these fishermen going out there and doing and engaging in aggressive activities. But this is nonetheless militia, because this is not quite the Chinese Navy, and neither is it the Chinese Coast Guard. But this vessel was within Indian EEZs, and Indian analysts suspect that this was gathering information about the sea environment, but it may also have been investigating the routes that in that Indian submarines take in that region. And so we did register a protest with China that ship was escorted out of the region, and since then there has been greater Indian patrolling in that space. The other thing that is of concern is that there are Chinese intelligence ships now operating in the space near the Andamans. There have been, I think, 2 instances over the past 6 to 8 months where Chinese intelligence ships have been found loitering around in that region. And that's, again, strange for India because, as I said initially, that India has no territorial dispute with China, and China's traditionally not sent these ships into Indian waters. So one of the reasons why they could be doing so is because they want to know more about what the Indian Navy, the sort of operations that is carrying out in the region, the exercises that it does with regional partners, including the US Navy and some other navies. And this particular sighting of the intelligence ships happened at a time when we were apparently doing a trilateral exercise with the US Navy or the US Armed Forces. And so, again, that's a matter of concern for India. So the way India looks at this is that the more we have these Chinese fishing ships, and by the way, I didn't mention the Chinese fishing fleets are all the more active over the past year or so. And some of them in the Western Indian Ocean have had Coast Guard escorts. Again, something that is new. It has not happened in the past that these fishing fleet come in and they are escorted by Chinese Coast Guard vessels. So all of this points to the fact that there is greater Chinese non-military presence in the Indian Ocean region, and that could only mean that China wants to have a greater footprint in the region. It wants somehow to strengthen its own presence in the region and wants to show the region that it's a regional stakeholder and that you should get used to seeing more of Chinese presence in the region. I mean, that's the only inference that we can draw from this. So yes, it's very different from the South China Sea militias, but it's militias nonetheless. John.
Yeah, great. The same individual, IFC-IOR, had another question in chat for Dr. Asyura, and that was about the migrant crisis and what impact that is having on the drug trafficking issues. I would say, could we enlarge that? Could we talk about how the migrant crisis is impacting both human security and other security issues in these waters and in the littoral states?
Thanks, John. I'm glad for the opportunity to speak a bit more on how the pandemic is impacting human security and also maritime security in that regard. Thanks very much to IFC-IOR for that question as well. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, the pandemic has demonstrated the ability to actually exacerbate fissures that are already taking place on land And this is also the case in the Rakhine State. In fact, as I mentioned, there has been a 74% increase in the level of conflict that has taken place in the Rakhine State from January to April 2020 as compared to the year before. And this has also correlated, as we have all heard, I'm sure, of having more migrants out there at sea and leaving them more vulnerable to the exposures posed by the maritime domain. And this has even led to, significant deaths and even an entire debate on who should be letting in these migrants as they try to escape conflict from the Rakhine State. However, the one particular implication from the migrant crisis is that this has also led to a rise in the transfer of yaba, which is a cheaper variant of crystal methamphetamine, from the Rakhine State into Cox's Bazar through TACNAF. And what actually happens is that a lot of these Rohingyas have been found smuggling yaba in their tummies. And this is definitely detrimental to their health, as we all know. But it also brings them, it also has an economic benefit to them. In fact, the smuggling of drugs in this way will be able to reward the Rohingyas up to $240 per trip. And that is huge. And that means a lot for them, especially when trying to flee their homes. But the pandemic hasn't at all impacted the rate of trafficking of yaba, for example, from the Rakhine State into Bangladesh through the use of the Rohingyas as mules. In fact, only 2 months ago, 30,000 tablets were seized off Cox's Bazar, demonstrating that the migrant crisis is, in fact, extremely significant, but it is also taking place with associated transnational crime, such as maritime drug trafficking.
So, John, I can see two questions. One is on lawfare. Would you like me to answer the question on lawfare?
Well, you seem eager to. So
No.
No, jokes aside. Yeah, you could. I'm actually also really interested in Sharon Satai's question, so maybe we could kind of merge the two together about U.S.-China rivalry. And I think there's already been some discussion of how much U.S.-China rivalry there is in the Bay of Bengal. But I would kind of add to that and say, how much should there be? I mean, the U.S. Historical presence with the partners around the Bay of Bengal is much less than its historic partnership with Southeast Asian states. In Southeast Asia, you have the legacy of SEATO, you have the legacy of colonialism, you have a long range of Cold War struggles that followed on into post-Cold War exercises and relationships. Because of the various different political situations, you see much less U.S. partnership in the Bay of Bengal. So if I don't mind a terrible barrel question, can I ask both of you to comment on what roles you would like to see of the United States and how the Chinese might use legal issues to balance out any developments in the region?
All right, so first on lawfare. So my sense is that the Chinese are not using these legal strategies in the Indian Ocean the same way that they use them in the South China Sea. Perhaps they could in the future once they have a greater presence in Sri Lanka, in Myanmar, and perhaps even in Bangladesh. But at the moment, it doesn't seem as if there's any elements of lawfare in what the Chinese strategy in the region is. I think the Chinese strategy in the region, if seen from an Indian lens, is simple: is that you create you invest in the region in economic terms, create stakeholdership for China in maritime security in the region, and also create an organic need for Chinese maritime forces to be in the region. And in that sense, then it's going to be very hard for the regional players to resist Chinese presence in the region. And they will not need to resort to any lawfare tactics to do that. The second question was about U.S.-China rivalry in the Eastern Indian Ocean. I don't think that that's a rivalry that we are actually seeing play out at the moment. I think the U.S. is here simply because of the fact that this is a region that it has neglected so far, and the fact that there is so much of Chinese interest in this region and Indian worry about China's interest in this region, that the US feels that it is somehow important for it to also be a player. And what we've seen happen over the past 2 or 3 years is that the US has been sending more naval deployments to Sri Lanka, to Bangladesh. For some of you that track naval affairs, you would know that the US Navy now does the karate exercises with both the Sri Lankan Navy as well as the Bangladeshi Navy. There's talk about an air logistics enclave in Sri Lanka. There was talk about status of forces agreement in Sri Lanka. The US is going to be training Sri Lankan Marines. The 7th Fleet has made a few trips to Sri Lanka, including I think last year there was an aircraft carrier that was there. So I think the US also is trying to up the tempo of its presence in the Eastern Indian Ocean. That does not in some ways mean that there is a growing rivalry with China, because things really haven't come to that pass at the moment. From India's point of view, if at all there is a rivalry, it's an India-China rivalry in that space. But again, it has to be said that the Chinese are not being very aggressive with what they're doing. It's really salami slicing of sorts. It's gradual incrementalism in the way that they're growing this presence, not in a way that India can really raise its hackles or do something that could precipitate a bigger conflict with China. So I think we'll have to wait and see how China increases its presence in the region, and then in the future, it is possible that we might see a US China rivalry play out. As for US presence, I think anything more than this would cause worry for both India and for the regional players. We wouldn't like to see too many US aircraft carriers in the region, or too much capacity building being done by the US, because remember, the US is not quite a regional player. It's if at all there is the preeminent power in the region, it is India. And so I think India would be uncomfortable to see too much of US presence in the region. What India would ideally like to see is greater India-US coordination along with other Quad partners, for instance, Australia and Japan, in building capacity in the region, in somehow coming up with alternate projects to the Belt and Road Initiative, and gradually pushing out the Chinese, keeping them out of the picture. John.
Thanks. Dr. Asyura, do you have anything to add on any of those topics?
Yeah, John, if I could just address your last question on what roles you think the United States should play in the Bay of Bengal. I feel that the United States can play a role in trying to detach the potential fishing nationalism crisis, for example, from traditional security interests. I think that there is a potential for people to view non-traditional issues within the Bay of Bengal and the Andaman Sea within a very sovereign-based kind of perspective. But in fact, I think the US will be able to try encourage more norms based on regional coordination. And this can be done by working with existing platforms that are already there on a more regional level. This would be with SARC, for example, that, as I learned, is currently engaged in addressing the pandemic, for example. On top of that, I think that the United States will be able to perhaps work with other regions and also other external partners in encouraging a regional fishery management organization or something that parallels to that at least. Nevertheless, in all policy approaches that are being taken, the United States would help in trying to encourage more research-driven and policy-inclusive approaches. And ultimately, the aim should be to prioritize the long-term sustainability of our fishery resources and safety at sea over national interests. And I think this is definitely a gap that the United States should seek to utilize or exploit. Thanks, John.
Okay. Jeremy Bachelier from the Information Fusion Center in Singapore just popped in with a really interesting question. And that is that you've both spoken about a dearth of information sharing and information in the Bay of Bengal and the Andaman Sea. But we have information fusion centers, for example, the one where he works in Singapore, that are seeking to expand into that space. So the question is, what do you think that could be done by the existing centers to improve the efficiency of their operations or to expand the results? Is there a need for a broader mandate, just more cooperation? Is it information sharing agreements? Is it information gathering, etc.? Asyura, if you want to take that first.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Jeremy, for that question. I'm glad you're looking into trying to better understand how Singapore IFC can perhaps contribute to better MDA. I'd like to maybe draw attention as well to the Information Fusion Center of the Indian Ocean Region representative that is also joining us on this call. And as you, Jeremy, asked, what can IFC do to better enable greater efficiency? Perhaps what all Information Fusion Centers across the region could do is to try to expand stakeholder engagement and to work with other regional actors, other Information Fusion Centers, maybe research institutions, or maybe nonprofit organizations, for example, into trying to better understand the roots of most of these incidents at sea, which we can see, a lot of them do include geopolitical or military maneuvers, but most of them are also maritime incidents, piracy and armed robbery, maritime drug trafficking, and not just drugs, other contrabands as well. So I think in-depth research would definitely help and trying to support that as well. I think the IFC could also help by producing more actionable and real-time information that perhaps other drug and maritime enforcement agencies would also be able to access and also work on this. John, if I'm going to be a bit cheeky, but also try to address another question up there, which also pertains to information sharing, or shall I wait for it to take hold?
Please be cheeky away.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Awesome, thanks. So I think the question by Mr. Kentaro Furuya was on whether there is an institutionalized system to exchange information sharing related to drug smuggling in the region. And I think this ties in very nicely with Jeremy's question, where IFCs across the region do have an opportunity to play a role in trying to institutionalize the sharing of not just information, but also intel. Ultimately, the main issue in trying to enhance interagency coordination between maritime law enforcement agencies, this would be Coast Guards, marine authorities, marine police, navies, and also drug enforcement agencies, is the lack of trust. A lot of agencies are hesitant to want to share information to such an extent, but I think by having a information fusion center to try and facilitate this, or a third party, for example, or an INGO would definitely be helpful. Other elements that we can look into trying to institutionalize a system would be through MOUs that already exist between certain maritime enforcement agencies across the region, but these are more of bilateral exchanges of information. I think hotlines would also help to build that trust that is needed to form the foundation to encourage more rapid intel sharing as well. I think what we can move towards institutionalizing the sharing of information is trying to build a database of maritime incidents. And this would include actionable intel, which includes the location of the ship, the size of the seizure, persons of interest, for example, in identification stamps and things like that can be shared widely across the region. And so agencies will be able to have a shared understanding to the detail of what kind of activities are taking place in the region. And in this sense, they would also be able to build MDA. And the pandemic is, in fact, inhibiting capacity building programs. I mean, we're having this discussion virtually when, in fact, I'd like to sit down and have a chat over to you with Abhijit and John and the rest of you. And I think an alternative would obviously be through, as I mentioned, the building of a database, for example, and having more virtual workshops, not just on a regional scale, but also on a national scale across the enforcement agencies as well. Thanks, John.
Abhijit, do you have comments to add about how information sharing can be improved in the region?
Yes, I just had one comment to make, which is that the essential logic of having better maritime domain awareness or better situational awareness really is that if you have a better sense of what's happening on the seas, you don't actually need too many physical assets to go out there and do the patrolling. So one of the problems that this region faces is just the lack of boats, of assets to go out there and gather the information that you need. And so if you have better intel sharing or information sharing, somebody else somewhere is gathering information that might be relevant to you. You're collating all that information in a fusion center, and then that information is disseminated for the use by everybody. And that in effect means that even with fewer assets, you're actually able to have a better sense of what's happening on the maritime domain or in the maritime domain. And so I think that I would agree essentially with what Surya said, that intel sharing and information sharing is key to better maritime security in the region. But I would also sort of draw your attention to the fact that that all sorts of information sometimes is not shared. Sometimes important information is somehow not shared. Now, you can call it a lack of trust. You could say that that there's classes of information, that there's really classified information in the sense that countries don't want to share with other partners, and that is a problem that we've seen often happen in the Bay of Bengal. But I would say that in the past, about 2 or 3 years, we have seen a greater coordinated effort on the part of all regional stakeholders to share what they can. And therefore, there is greater trust now between the Coast Guards, the Marine Police, the Customs. More importantly, what we have now is MLAT treaty, meaning a mutual law assistance treaty, in which we are actually trying to sync our legal procedures also. So not only do you have information about what's happening on sea, in case you apprehend criminals and the criminals belong to some other country, you actually have procedures by which you can try those people, you can send them across to their country of origin, and so I think that we're making some significant movement forward. Lastly, and I think most importantly, the Indian Ocean Fusion Center, which is in Delhi or which is in India in Gurgaon, is actually now looking at ways in which it can have some sort of a linkage with the IFC in Singapore. And my information might be just a little dated. It's possible that there's already something that has come about. But the last that I heard was that there is an effort being made to sync both these centers, and that will then mean that if there is if there are some vessels on the Western Pacific and the South China Sea that make their way across into the Indian Ocean region, there can be exchange of information between these two centers, and we can actually know about what's now happening on the Indian Ocean side. So I think we are making considerable progress forward when it comes to MDA. And I repeat the point that I made, that once you have better MDA, you don't actually need too much capacity. And as Surya rightly mentioned, in a post-COVID era, we are all going to grapple with capacity. We are not going to have enough capacity to go out there and sort of hunt for those criminals. So I think this is just a move in the right direction. Thank you.
Okay, by my watch, we have 1 minute left. Unfortunately, we have at least 3 questions unanswered. So what I'd like to do is just kind of comment that these questions talk about the importance of energy security, questions of whether China is more involved with purely a rivalry with India, or whether it's trying to secure its SLOCs, a question about the role of the Quad, and a question about how the South China Sea conflict may spill over and how the outcomes of that may affect the Bay of Bengal. So I'd ask you to not try to answer all those, but sort of take a minute to wrap up, address any of it that you have something burning to say about, and sort of round out your comments. If you could each take 2 minutes, and I'll start by handing the mic right back to you, Abhijit.
So let me just take a stab at that question on the South China Sea and how events in the South China Sea might play out in the Eastern Indian Ocean. I think the fear in India is that once China has a better grip over the South China Sea islands, the island territories where it is building some kind of garrisons, military garrisons, these will be used to project power into the Indian Ocean region. And for those that have been tracking developments in recent days, we know that the Chinese now have a governance system in place for both the Spratlys and the Parasols. And the fact now that they are going to be deploying, or they are deploying fighter aircraft, surveillance aircraft on these islands, ferry crafts, Subi Reef, etc., means that they have a better sense of dominance over the space, and they are now going to use that dominance to project power into the Indian Ocean region. So I think what's going to happen, I think in the future, is that we're actually willy-nilly going to see more Chinese presence in the region. I don't think they are here to pick a fight with India. I don't think they see India as an adversary. It's an irritant, but I think because they have a running rivalry with the U.S. and the Indian Ocean happens to be a space where the U.S. Navy is also dominant, I think the Chinese will seek to have greater presence in these waters. Lastly, I think about energy security. I think energy security is critical. And it's ironical that we've not really touched on this very critical subject in this discussion, because this was really a Bay of Bengal discussion. Had it been an Indian Ocean discussion, I'm sure energy security would have come up. But SOLOC security really sits at the heart of maritime security. So most of what the Indian Navy does is basically to ensure that the SLOCs or the sea lanes are safe, which is why the Indian Navy has been making deployments or been contributing to the anti-piracy effort off the coast of Somalia. So I think energy security going forward is also going to be a key piece of the puzzle, and a number of regional states are also going to be focused on it. And as regards China has very clearly said that all it cares about when it comes to the Indian Ocean is really the safety of Chinese shipments. Energy shipments and shipments of resources, and as long as these can be kept safe, China does not quite have a stake in what's happening in the Indian Ocean region. I think we take that with a grain of salt. We don't quite believe that, but the fact is the Chinese also are talking quite loudly about their energy security, and the Malacca dilemma that they talk about, which again hasn't come up for discussion, really is about energy, about the fact that they need alternate routes to the Malacca Straits. So yes, energy security going forward is also going to be critical, and I think the Indians are going to have to distribute the focus, the attention between non-traditional security issues, between infrastructure building in the Indian Ocean region, and between ensuring that the sea lanes remain safe. So I'm going to, I just think, end here. Thank you, John.
Okay, Asyura, do you have any closing remarks to enlighten us with?
Thanks, John. Yeah, I thought I'd like to reiterate that we look a lot at the South China Sea, and then we use that as a benchmark to try and understand other maritime zones. But I'd like to at least set out a warning that as we look into other maritime areas in the Eastern Indian Ocean, for example, and as they may potentially grow in geopolitical significance, I feel that it's important for us to try avoid hybrid challenges and the potential for the fishing nationalism tactics, for example. And moving forward, I think we need to understand that maritime security should be a broader concept and should be understood as a broader concept that goes beyond traditional security interests. In fact, it can actually impact and have a direct implication and long-term implication as well on the livelihoods of not just those living around the coast, but on the entire region as well, economically speaking. And in doing so, I feel that in trying to detach non-traditional issues from a potential traditional security implication, we will need to try to embrace more holistic approaches and to embrace and include other stakeholders as well when working on the maritime security non-traditional issues. We've got regional centers such as the IFC, which set a really good precedence in trying to work at a regional level and in trying to be open enough to want to engage other stakeholders. And I think in doing so, we are able to see that maritime security is in fact inclusive of other non-traditional issues as well, including but not exclusive to maritime drug trafficking, IUU fishing, illicit migration, for example. And then moving forward, I hope that we will all be able to embrace a whole of society approach when working with other stakeholders in trying to address not just traditional maritime security issues, but also the entire array of maritime security areas as well. Thanks very much, John, and thanks for this opportunity.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. I'd like to thank both of you for giving your time to us tonight. It's not a small thing or an invaluable asset, so thank you very much. On behalf of, I'd like to extend that on behalf of both YCAPS and Pacific Forum. And I'd like to also thank the participants for taking the time to tune in, be a part of this conversation, both learn from the experts, but also your questions informed us as well. So thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing many of you at Maritime Discussion Series number 6, which we're hoping to organize for later this month of June. Thank you very much. Good night from Tokyo.